Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, The Visual Elements. In this chapter, we'll be discussing the elements of art. When we look at art, we first tend to look and see what it depicts, the subject matter. What is it that an artwork is showing us? But we also need to be aware of the painting as well and the elements that the artist is using. So in this piece, Landscape with Yellow Birds by Paul Klee in 1923, we can see a lot of different visual elements, such as we have some fluid curving lines here, these white lines that tend to divide the composition into several sections. Then we have mass that's been flattened into shapes, such as the birds, as well as these kind of plant-like forms. The shapes are seen against this black background, so they pop out against the background. The positioning of the birds are going to suggest a moment of time without necessarily movement, but there is kind of this implied visual movement that happens in this circular motion because of the birds. The light is used to illuminate the yellow color of the birds, and texture is going to be used to provide further interest in other areas of the painting, such as the leaves, such as this kind of rock form. So it provides visual interest. And the abstractness that the artist has used creates this fantasy, dreamlike, whimsical image through the elements of art. The first element that we're going to talk about is line. Line is defined by path traced by a moving point. Linear forms are those in which length dominates over width. We're looking at a piece by Keith Haring from 1982 called Untitled. And in it, we're seeing a body defined by green lines, as well as waves and the dolphin and some background lines. Those lines around the figure are meant to show us the separation between the figure and the space. In reality, when we look at a figure, there are no lines dividing the figure from the space, but those lines are there to kind of symbolically define that separation. In this piece, Circus Circa, from 1992, the lines are there to be experienced in and of themselves, and they're really meant to just guide your eye around the space and make you, as the viewer, experience the space in a new way. So when we're talking about line, there are several characteristics of line that I want to talk to you about. The first is actual line. Okay, so this is where we're actually seeing that path traced by a moving point. There's implied line, where you have kind of these little dots and your eye connects those and creates a line. Oops, I'm sorry. The actual straight lines and implied lines. So we have straight lines here, but then the implied line happens where the ends of the lines are. We have a line here created by the edge of the black and the white. So there's this line right in between them. We have what we call vertical line, which goes up and down, and then horizontal line, which goes side to side. Diagonal lines are going to go diagonally across the picture plane, and you can see when it's just slightly diagonal, it's going to feel more like slow action, and then when it's more vertically diagonal, it's going to have fast action. There's jagged, sharp lines that you can see here. This kind of geometric, triangular forms. And then we have curving lines that create almost like a dancing movement. We have hard line versus soft line. So the hard line has this hard edge and the soft line has a soft edge. And artists can use these different characteristics to create the type of movement that they want, the type of mood that they want in an artwork. So when we're looking at this piece, Woman Dancer with a Fan and Wand from 1708, in it we can see a lot of curving lines. So you can see a lot of organic, kind of free-flowing line all throughout the image. And then when we can contrast this to another piece where we're seeing a figure dancing, in this one we have more angular line. So we have straight lines with sharp angles that are kind of throughout the painting or throughout the image. And when you contrast these, you can see that they create a very different sense of motion. So in the first piece that I showed you, this one has more of a rhythmic motion, sensuous motion, whereas this one has more of a violent, swift action feeling to it. And that's all because of the type of line that's being used. Another type of line is contour line, and contour lines define three-dimensional mass on a two-dimensional surface. So you can see here how Jennifer Pastor has used contour line to define the bulls as well as the rider in this flow chart for the perfect ride. Now, lines also create direction and movement within works of art, and your eye tends to follow line like a train on a track. So if it sees a line, it wants to follow it. And this is a great example of that, a photograph by Cartier-Bresson from 1951. And your eye is going to, it'll start with the forms that are nearest to it. And it starts with these vertical lines that go up to this diagonal line that leads your eye down here. Then it comes up with this vertical line. Then it goes over to this vertical line and down these diagonal lines. And you'll notice that there are spots that you kind of stop and look at, like these figures here. You stop, you look at those figures, then you jump up here and you look at these figures, and then the line brings you back to these figures. So the line here is meant to create a composition and lead your eye to the figures in the photograph. When we see a diagonal line, like this one here, for example, that is going to imply movement, and the more diagonal it is, the more movement you're going to see. Vertical lines are very dynamic in that they defy gravity and they're going to lead your eye upward. And then horizontal lines are going to be very placid and very stabilizing. You'll notice that there really aren't any horizontal lines in this photograph, even ones that are almost horizontal or slightly diagonal. So this piece is just full of movement. It doesn't really have any of those stabilizing horizontal lines. And that is contrast with this one. This is the Biglin Brothers Racing by Thomas Eakins from 1873. And in this painting, we can see a lot of horizontals. For example, the boat that they're in, the separation between land and water back here, and even the tree line is somewhat horizontal. All of these horizontal, and you can even see the lines in the water are horizontals. All of these horizontals are broken up by just the simple diagonal of the oar, subtle diagonal of the oar, which implies movement. So we get the sense that these boats are moving, but it's a very stable movement. If you've ever seen, the rowers row in like the Olympics, they're moving very fast, but it's such a stable movement. They're not tipping back and forth or anything like that. So you really get a sense of the motion when you analyze the lines. And this one we have a lot of diagonals, and really all the lines here are diagonals. And they're meant to be very dramatic. So if you look, for example, of the raft, all of the lines are going off to one side or the other. The pole that's going up here is a diagonal. The ropes are diagonal. The figures themselves become a diagonal line. We'll talk more about an implied line here in a moment, but if you follow the heads like little dots of a line, they create a diagonal line. So everything here is giving you movement, tension, and giving you kind of different focal points. You look at, well, the peak of this triangle here, the implied triangle. We see a figure here who's looking off into the distance, perhaps seeing a rescue boat. If we look up here, we see another figure here kind of reaching out, and all the diagonals are leading your eyes to these different focal points. So I mentioned implied lines when we looked at that last one. We also have a very strong implied line here. This is the Embarcation for Cythera by Watteau from 1718. And when we see heads of people, we tend to want to follow those. And you can kind of see them as little dots. And our eye is going to follow these little dots throughout the composition. And it kind of creates this, like I said, implied line. So it's not a physical line, but it's a line nonetheless. And it draws your eye through the figures in the foreground to the figures in the background to help move your eye around the composition. All right, the next elements that we're going to talk about are shape and mass. Mass is three-dimensional form that occupies a volume of space. And so it's a sculpture. It's something that has height, width, and depth. This is The Raven and the First Men by Bill Reed from 1983, a sculpture. We're seeing the photograph of that sculpture, and we can tell that it is a three-dimensional form by the way that the light creates shadow. So light is going to hit the parts that are closest to it and then create shadow where there is no light. And so that reveals that three-dimensional form. Now, one thing about three-dimensional forms is that you really can't fully understand it unless you are either physically there and can walk around it, or you're seeing a video of it. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at sculpture. We're only seeing one angle of it. Shape is two-dimensional form that occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. And in the work that we're looking at here, Chanter by Whitehorse from 1991, we see a lot of different shapes defined in different ways. For example, if we look here, we can see these triangles are defined by line, okay? And then we see these more organic, this almost pitchfork-like form here, the human form here, the bird-like form here. This is defined by a color shift, so it's a darker color than the background. There are different types of shapes here. There are geometric, like the triangles, and then there's more organic forms, like the bird and the human form. So geometric shapes are regular named shapes. So those shapes that we have names for, like triangle, square, rectangle. And then organic shapes are going to be more irregular. They're going to evoke forms found in nature, so things like plants, things like humans. And though some geometric shapes exist in nature, it's more on a microscopic level, usually, where you see crystals, like the substructure of a crystal, honeycomb, snowflakes. But most shapes that you find in nature are going to be organic, or what we call biomorphic. So when we're looking at this work, we see some shapes that stand out from the background. We can refer to this as figure. So when shape is detached from the background, it's known as positive shape or figure. And that is opposed to ground, which is the surrounding visual information that the figure stands out from, or that negative space. So the ground here is going to be this light kind of blue that looks like it kind of takes over the background in the entire piece. And then the figure is going to be like the bird form here, the triangular shape here, the seed-like form here. Those things that stand out from the background. Hopefully that makes sense. Sometimes when we're looking at an artwork, both the light figure and the dark background, in this case, could seem to be interchangeable. So here in this work by a circular shield with stepped fret design from the Aztec culture from 1521, we're seeing a work in which you really can't tell which one is the background and which one is the foreground. You see this red line that's kind of dividing them. And then some, you can make yourself see the yellow part stick out, like that's the foreground. Or if you change your perception, you can see the dark shape stick out and then the yellow is the background. So sometimes it can be kind of impossible to tell which one is which. And an artist can use that in their work to create content. So in this piece by M.C. Escher called Sky and Water 1 from 1938, on the bottom, it's very clear what is the figure, right? The fish is the figure and the black is the ground. Whereas in the top of the composition, we have the bird being the figure and the white being the ground. And as you move towards the middle of the composition, you'll start to see some of the detail disappear. and then the shape kind of switches into the ground as you move down or up the image. We also have, oh, let me go back to that real quick. And that really can kind of, in this particular case, is contributing to this content of how everything is kind of interconnected in the world. We also have implied shape. Implied shape is very much like implied line, where the artist is going to give you some clues, and then your eye kind of fills in that information. So when we look at this, and I say, well, what shape do you see here? Probably your first instinct is going to be, well, I see a triangle, because of these like Pac-Man shapes that are angled in such a way that our eye kind of connects these dots and makes it a triangle, when in reality we don't actually see a triangle, right? We actually see the Pac-Man shapes. That is the figure and the ground is the white. But an artist can use that to create a strong composition. So this is the Madonna of the Meadows by Raphael from 1505, and in it we see an implied triangle. And we can see the foot here, the Madonna, and then we have a child's foot here, and then her head here. That is going to be like those Pac-Man shapes. Excuse me. Excuse me. That kind of anchor the triangle, and then our eye fills in that information and makes it a triangle. And anytime that you see a triangle in a composition, you'll see that very commonly during the Renaissance. It's there to stabilize the composition. So you have the strong horizontal base that helps stabilize the composition. So our next element is light. And when we're talking about light, light obviously is going to reveal the world around us and help us tell when things are two-dimensional or three-dimensional, help us tell what the texture is. And that is what we can see here in The Visit by Bravo from 1935. So in it we can see some statues that are being lit, and you can tell what direction the light is coming from. It's coming from over here, and you can tell that because the light is shining on the closest point to the light, and then the shadow is going to be the furthest away from the light. You can also tell what type of light it is by looking at the contrast between the light areas and the shadow. There's not really any subtle variation. It goes from really light to really dark. And you can see that all over, like if you look at the robe here, light to dark. You can also see the texture of the wall being revealed by the way the light is shining on it. So you can imagine what that would feel like if you ran your hand across it. Value is going to refer to shades of light and dark as seen in the robes of the statues here. Different qualities of light can create different perceptions of a work of art. So for example, if we look at this statue of Abraham Lincoln from Daniel Chester French from 1922, this is seen in daylight. And the artist, when originally saw this, the sculptor was not happy with the lighting because it really made Abraham Lincoln kind of look frightened. If you ever seen like a horror movie where the figures are lit from below, it's that way to make them look like they're scared, like holding a flashlight under your face, for example, when you tell a ghost story. It's there to make you look frightened. So he didn't like this lighting, so they placed a spotlight above the sculpture, and that completely transforms the piece. It makes it, first of all, it's stronger than natural light, so you can see more of a contrast between the lights and the darks, but it also creates more of an angular look to Abraham Lincoln's face, which in turn makes him seem like more of a powerful person, more of a powerful leader. So just by changing the quality of the light and the direction of the light, you can completely change the content of a work of art. Da Vinci is known for his use of a technique called chiaroscuro. This is a technique where the artist is going to use lights and darks to reveal mass. So as opposed to The Visit by Bravo, the first image that we looked at, where we had that really high contrast between lights and darks, chiaroscuro is where you're going to see just a really subtle transition from light to darks. And so you're going to see all of these different values in between the really light areas and the dark areas. You can see how Da Vinci here has actually used the color of the paper, which is this kind of brown color, to provide a mid-tone. Then he used white chalk to provide highlights, and then charcoal to give us the shadows. You'll also notice that there's kind of an overall light source. It's not necessarily strong from one side or the other, but you get this sense of a kind of a soft sense of lighting, which in turn makes the piece feel kind of soft and inviting. Artists can use line to reveal value, to reveal light. This is a great example of that, Untitled by Charles White from 1919. Actually, I think it's from 1979. I think that's a typo. I need to look that up. But the line here is going to reveal the value. And we have a technique called hatching, where you see these lines that are kind of parallel to each other, and then cross hatching, where you see the lines that are perpendicular to each other. The artist has used paper to create highlights, that just the color of the paper, and then the hatching is going to create lighter areas, and then the cross hatching is going to create the shadow. So you can actually use light to create value. All right, our next element that we're going to talk about is color, and color is a function of light. Different colors are going to create different responses, and color is just reflected light rays, and depending on the wavelength of the ray is going to depend on is going to give you the color. When we talk about color, we need to discuss the color wheel. The color wheel is what we're seeing right here, and when we talk about the color wheel, you'll notice that it has the names of the colors on the outside of the ring, and then it has some numbers on the inside of the ring. The ones, these are primary colors, so that's the yellow, the blue, and the red, and these colors cannot be mixed from other colors. Then we have the twos, and these twos are secondary colors, and they're a mixture between two of the primary colors. So 1 + 1 is 2. Yellow plus red is orange. And then we have the tertiary colors, and they're the threes. Okay, and we have 6 of those. And the tertiary colors are a mix between a primary color and a secondary color. So 1 + 2 is 3. So the secondary colors are orange, green, and violet. And then the tertiary colors are going to be yellow-orange, yellow-green, blue-green, blue-violet, red-violet, and red-orange. So basically just those two color names put next to each other. We can also divide the colors into primary, secondary, and tertiary. We can also divide the color wheel into warm and cool colors. So if you divide it right here, on this side of that line, these are the cool colors, and then on this side of the line, they're the warm colors. And those colors can be used in certain combinations to create certain different color schemes, which in turn can help create content, create the mood of a composition. So this is a good example of an artist using color scheme. This is Palette with a Landscape by Pissarro, and it's kind of an interesting piece because it's done on an artist's palette, which is something that painters use to mix paint. So it's kind of a play on words. Palette is referring to the colors used as well as the painter's tool that's being used. Here, the artist has used colors that are only on the color wheel. So we can go through all of those different colors, like we have the primary red, blue, and yellow. And then we have the secondary colors that are green, orange, and I don't really see any purple in here, but basically primary and secondary colors the artist has used. When we talk about color, we also need to talk about the 3 properties of color: hue, value, and intensity. Hue is the name of the color according to the color wheel. So when I say yellow, that's the hue. The value is going to be the lightness or the darkness of the color. And colors have an inherent lightness to darkness. So when you look at yellow, it's lighter than purple, for example. So it's going to have a lighter value than purple. So value refers to lightness and darkness. Now you can add black to a color and that will give it a shade. So a shade is a color darker than the hue's normal value. And then if you add white to a color, that's going to give you a tint, which is a color lighter than the hue's normal value. So let me give you an example. Let's take the hue red. Okay, if we add black to that, that's going to turn it into more of a maroon color. Whereas if we add white to it, it's going to turn it into pink. So pink is a tint of red and maroon is a shade of red. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the third property is intensity. And intensity refers to the relative purity of color. So if you look at a hue, that's going to be the most intense color that you can get of that hue. So here we have the pure hue of yellow and the pure hue of violet. If you add yellow to violet, it's going to become dulled. Okay, if you add violet to yellow, it's going to become dulled. So that's a less intense, like this one's a less intense yellow than this one. Okay, so the selective use of two or more colors in a composition are known as color harmonies. And there are several different color harmonies that we're going to talk about. The first is monochromatic. Monochromatic refers to a composition that uses the same hue with different values or intensities. An example of that can be seen here in Nocturne in Blue and Gold by James Whistler from 1872. In it, what we're seeing mostly, this is not a purely monochromatic composition because it does have some yellow, but the majority of the composition is blues, right? So we see kind of a regular blue here, then we see shades of blue, and we see tints of blue. So we see kind of a less intense blue, but then we also see shades and tints of that less intense blue. We'll come back to this in a second. Then we have complementary colors, and these are colors that are opposite on the color wheel. This is a great example of that, Pool in a Brook by Porter from 1953. And when we look at the color wheel and we look at this composition, you can see that we have the blues here, really going into purples. And then we have kind of a orange and a yellow orange here, and then into reds. So really these are opposite colors. So if we look at the majority of the blue and then the orange, okay, look here, orange is right opposite of blue. So these are what we call complementary colors, and those are used normally to create a really dynamic composition because your eye, when you see complementary colors, they kind of bounce off each other because they have opposite wavelengths. And so it creates a really dynamic sensation. We'll come back to that one too. Analogous refers to colors that are adjacent on a color wheel. This is On the Terrace by Matisse. And in it, he's basically using all of the primary and secondary colors. So if we go through them, we'll start with yellow. So you can see some of the yellow, the highlights of the goldfish in here. And then you have greens in the, and then also yellows here, greens in the garb of the figure here. Blue, lots of blues, but this is the pure hue of blue up here. We also have some blue-green in the background here. Violet, the rug that she's sitting on. Red, right here, the inner shoes here. Orange, you can see on the rim here as well as in the bowl. And then goes back to yellow. So we went all the way around the color wheel and we see those colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. Triadic refers to any three colors that are equidistant on the color wheel. This is Rooms by the Sea by Hopper from 1951. And in it, we're actually seeing a primary color scheme. You see the red, yellow, and blue. and yellow, red, and blue, those are equidistant on the color wheel. So we could refer to this as a triadic color scheme or a primary color scheme. So going back to this piece by Porter, I want to talk to you a little bit about the optical effects of color. When we look at certain colors, some tend to recede, so they go back into the background, and some tend to advance, so they kind of pop out at us. Cool colors like blues and greens, those tend to recede, and warm colors like reds and oranges and yellows tend to come at us, pop out of that composition. And these can be used to alter our perception of space. I think it's interesting in this one how the artist has chosen to do a composition where we have cooler colors at the bottom, which are closer to us, and warmer colors up at the top, which are further away. And what this tends to do, because these warm colors tend to pop out at us, is that it tends to flatten out the composition, right? So even though they're further away, they're coming at us through the optical illusion of those warm colors. Another optical effect of color is a technique called pointillism. This is where you put dots of pure hue next to each other, and then you rely on the eye to mix them. Georges Seurat is the inventor of pointillism. This is his A Sunday Afternoon on Le Grand Jatte from 1884. And in it, this is a very large piece. I think it's about 13 feet wide, if I remember correctly. And if you get up close to this, you're going to see just tiny little dots. And then when you move further away, that's the only time that you can actually see what's going on as the colors then mix together. So, for example, if we were to look at an area in the grass, like this light area right here, there's probably a dot of green next to a dot of yellow. This might be a dot of green next to a dot of black. And these colors are going to mix together through the an optical illusion. Our eye kind of connects the dots, if you will. And what this does is it kind of creates, well, it's just kind of an interesting optical effect, but it also creates a really static feeling in the composition. Colors also have emotional effects, and emotional responses are culturally dependent as well as very personal. So an example of that can be saying, if I say, what do the colors red and green make you think of? You might say, well, they make me think of Christmas. But we look at this piece. This is The Night Cafe by Van Gogh. He's using red and green. I don't think any of us think of Christmas when we look at this. The red and the green it's a complementary color scheme, and it creates a really dynamic sensation where your eye tends to kind of bounce back and forth. And really it's made in this particular piece to make you feel somewhat uncomfortable. So it can be very culturally dependent, but it also can be personal. So the artist used it here in a more personal way. Going back to this piece, Nocturne in Blue and Gold, the blues here kind of give us a certain feeling. And when you look at this, you probably have a really kind of calming sensation, and that's reinforced by the static, stable horizontals as well as the strong vertical in this composition. So everything here is meant to kind of be very calm and quiet as the sun is kind of setting in this scene. Then we have a piece like The Scream by Edvard Munch from 1893. And in it, we're seeing a lot of the different colors on the color wheel, but primarily we're seeing like blues and oranges, and those are complementary colors. So again, we have that complementary colors, very dynamic. Then we have those swirling lines, the really strong diagonal line here, the figure that looks like it's organic and it's kind of swaying. All of these aspects go together to create the feeling that the artist wants you to get, which is this very kind of unstable, frightening, dynamic sensation. All right, so the next element, we're going to talk about texture and pattern. Texture refers to surface quality, so how something feels when you run your hand across it. That's actual texture, okay? So actual texture is tactile, it is what you feel when you run your hand across a surface, but it also can contribute to the meaning and understanding of the meaning in a work of art. This is Bird in Space by Brancusi from 1925. We've seen this piece before, but here we're seeing it in a museum setting where you're actually seeing it on a pedestal. And the pedestal is this part that the artist actually made. So a lot of times when you see pedestals, they're just rectangular white boxes, right? But Brancusi made his pedestals on purpose to enhance the meaning of his sculptures. So let's start it down at the bottom. And this particular part of his pedestal is made out of wood, and you can actually see the lines of the grain of the wood, and you can see like there's a little crack here. So you can imagine what that would feel like when you run your hand across it. It would feel kind of rough. And then you move up here, and this is stone, limestone. And when you run your hand across it, you can see that that would be pretty soft and smooth. And then you move up and we have marble. And that marble is going to be even smoother to the touch. So we go from rough to smooth to like satiny smooth. So there's this refinement in texture as you move up the sculpture that's enhancing that upward movement of the piece. So everything here is leaning towards that verticality of the piece, that upward movement of the bird in space. This is Object from Merritt Oppenheim, and in it she's used texture to completely transform an object. So when you look at this, it's a teacup, a spoon, and a saucer that have been covered in fur. And that fur changes the meaning of the object, it takes away the functionality of the object, and it also probably gives you a kind of an uncomfortable feeling. You can imagine what it would feel like to put that spoon in your mouth, for example. It would not feel pleasant. The texture here really changes the meaning of the object and gives an uncomfortable feeling to the viewer. Then we have what we call visual texture, and this is a depiction of how light reflects on a surface. And you don't always have to touch it to know the texture, okay? So this is a great example of visual texture where we have, you have this regatta. So all of these boats that are on the ocean, and you can see the ocean, you can imagine that it's really wavy by the way that the artist has used the visual texture, right? Created these lines that in turn create the feeling of movement within the water. So it's a really choppy day, it looks like. It doesn't look like the water's really calm. And you get that sense just by the appearance of the brush strokes and the contrast between the white and the blue. And then we have pattern. Pattern refers to any decorative, repetitive motif or design. And it tends to flatten space when you see a lot of pattern next to each other, which you can see here in this photograph by Chiata from the 1950s. So we have pattern in the background, we have pattern in the middle ground, and we have pattern in the foreground. And there's so much pattern that it tends to kind of, almost her figure gets lost in there and tends to flatten out the image. All right, so then we have space, and there's a couple different types of space as well. 3D space is space that objects exist in, so real space. This is The Nose by Giacometti from 1947. Giacometti was interested in how we perceive objects in space, and he's used the frame here, the cube, to kind of enclose this figure in a way. So it's almost like he's enclosing space, but then you'll notice how the nose cuts through this invisible barrier, right? So this looks like a wall, but it's actually not. And so he's cutting through that invisible barrier, and that tends to exaggerate the nose and make it feel even larger. We also have three-dimensional real space on the interiors of buildings. This is the interior of the Guggenheim Bilbao from Gehry from 1997. When you experience the outside of buildings as mass and the interior as volume, as a sequence of enclosed spaces. Architecture actually shapes space literally, and we experience space as we exist in it, so as we're walking through it. A good example of this is to imagine yourself in a room with a low ceiling, like an 8-foot ceiling. Okay, imagine yourself there. Now raise the ceiling to 15 feet. Now add skylights. Now replace the walls with glass. So changing the character of space can change your experience of it and change the way you feel in that space. Okay, and then we have implied space. And implied space is suggesting depth in 2 dimensions. And there's different ways to do that. And this little diagram shows you some of those ways. So first we have overlapping. Okay, so when one shape overlaps another, it seems like it's in front of it. So we can tell that this circle's in front, this one's in middle, and this one's in back. Okay. Then we have changing the scale. So you can see as you get smaller, things tend to look like they're further away. So this one actually has overlapping, but it also has changing scale. And this one we see vertical placement. So things that are towards the bottom of the picture plane are going to feel closer, like this one. So this one feels the closest, this one's in the middle, and then this one feels like it's in the background because it's at the top of the picture plane. And then this one, we see all of those things, right? So we see overlapping. So we see this circle's in the foreground, this one's second, third, and then fourth, just through the overlapping. Then you have the vertical placement. So because it's at the bottom, this circle is closest to us. And then this circle is the furthest away because it's up at the top. And then we also have diminishing size. So this one's the largest, and then this one's the smallest. So which one of these is most effective? Well, this one is most effective because it's combining all of the different methods. Okay, so there's several ways to show depth in a work of art like we just saw. One of these is defined as linear perspective. Linear perspective is a technique that was developed during the Renaissance to be very visually convincing. In it, forms are going to become smaller as you move further away, and parallel lines seem to converge. And where they converge, so where they intersect, so let's look at these 2 lines here, for example. If we continue this into space, you'll notice that they're going to intersect kind of right in the middle right here. And that's called the vanishing point. And you'll see that all of the lines in this single point perspective are going to go right to that vanishing point. So if you follow any of them, they're going to meet in the same spot. And so it's kind of a scientific way of creating depth in a work of art. A good example of seeing this in real life is if you imagine yourself on a highway that's like a really long highway and flat. The road's not going to be, it's not going to look parallel. It's actually going to look like the lines converge on the horizon line. So that's a good example of where you can see linear perspective in real life. Foreshortening is perspective used in human and animal form. So a good example of this can be seen here in this illustration. Where you can see, like if you look at this figure, you can see the feet of the man and then the legs. Look at the legs and see they look like they're short. If you can imagine what he would look like standing up, the legs are going to look longer standing up than they would laying down. A good example of that is to take your finger and point it up at the ceiling and look at how long it is. And then I want you to point it away from you and look at how short it looks. Okay, so that is an example of foreshortening. Then we have atmospheric perspective, and this is used a lot of the times in landscape paintings to create a sense of deep space. And this is where the atmosphere is going to become bluer or hazy as you go further back into the distance. And that's because the particles suspended in the atmosphere are going to scatter light. And this is, I mean, if you look if you're out in the country sometime and you look far off into the distance, you're going to notice that things seem hazier as they get further back. And that is because of all those particles in the atmosphere. So this is a good example of that, the Rocky Mountains by Bierstadt from 1863. So in the foreground, everything looks really crystal clear. The hues are really, pure. And then as you move back into space, like the middle ground here, for example, it starts to get hazy. And then as you move into the far background, this mountain, you can almost barely see it because of how light and kind of bluish it is. But by doing that, the artist has created this sense of really deep space. And then we have what we call isometric perspective. This is commonly used in Chinese paintings. And with isometric perspective, you're actually going to see the lines are going to be parallel to each other. So they're not going to converge, they're going to stay parallel. And this type of perspective is good for making diagrams because you can actually label like how many inches it would be, and it's not going to be confusing with the lines becoming smaller as they go back into the distance. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about time and motion, which became linked to art in the 20th century because of technical developments, such as video, photography. But we're going to start a little bit before that with the art of Monet. This is Haystack at Sunset from 1891. And he often painted in series, and this is part of a series. So let's look at some of the different ones that he painted. So it's all the same subject matter. We're seeing haystacks, but we're seeing them at different times of the day and in different times of the year. And so he's playing around with how we perceive things in different lights at different times of the day. And in order to really fully understand one of these works, you need to see all of them. We also have Futurism, which developed in the early 1900s, and this movement was a reaction to technical developments, and it really celebrates everything that was happening during the early 1900s. So it celebrates motion, speed, energy, and daring. This is Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash by Bala from 1939. And in it, we're seeing the representation of the motion of a person walking a dog, right? And really the dog is the focal point. And you can see how the artist has chosen to do this by representing a leg over and over and over again, representing the tail over and over and over again. So we're seeing many different moments in time being compressed into one image. And part of this is the result of photography being developed and how photography was able to capture, many different moments in a sequential order. Then we have artists who actually deal with real motion, physical, kinetic motion in their works. This is Lobster Trap and Fishtail by Alexander Calder from 1939. He developed mobiles, which nowadays you can see them over, baby cribs and such, but he was actually the one that made them really popular in the art world. And mobiles employ actual kinetic motion. So if you were to see this in person, it would be spinning slowly through the air and changing as time passed. So really employing both movement and time in his work. Then we have video art. Nam June Pak was the first artist to employ video in their work. This is One Candle from 1988. And in it, we're seeing a candle that's representing the passing of time. Like we've seen the candle in the Vanitas paintings, for example, and it represents the passing of time. But here we're seeing a video of that candle burning down. The movement of the viewer also becomes important. I believe as you're walking around and looking at this video, the lights on the walls actually changes. And then lastly, we have the Scrabble game by David Hockney. And in it, he's given us this representation of a pretty common game, which is Scrabble. But we're seeing it in all of these different moments in time. And you can see all these different expressions on the players' faces. You know, sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're concerned or worried. And so you get a real clear sense of gameplay and how that changed over time. So that brings us to the end of chapter 4. In chapter 5, we're going to discuss the principles of design, which are basically how these elements are going to be used in a work of art. So we'll continue on with our discussion of the elements and principles in chapter 5.